So I'm happy to introduce our featured keynote speaker. I had the opportunity to get to know him when I was at the School of Public Health here at the University of Michigan. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Enrique Neblett. Dr. Neblett is a professor of health behavior and health education and the associate director of the Detroit Community Academic Urban Research Center at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. He is one of the leading U.S. scholars in the area of racism and health, with a particular focus on understanding how racism-related stress influences the mental and physical health of African-American young people. Dr. Neblett is a recipient of the Society for Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology Distinguished Career Award. He is the recipient of numerous teaching and mentoring awards, including recognition as Mentor of the Year by the Black Caucus of the Society for Research and Child Development. We are so pleased to now welcome Dr. Neblett, who will be sharing his talk, Youth, Mental Health, and Employment Equity, Reducing Inequality for Black Youth in Detroit.
All right, thank you for the warm introduction and good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to be here as a featured speaker this morning, speaking to you on some of the work that we've been doing over the last several years in the racial equity and mental health space. By way of following what was earlier modeled, I will quickly introduce myself as a African-American and Afro-Latina male who is sporting at the moment a salt and pepper goatee and beard, light salt and pepper goatee beard. And I am in my office, which is a mess at the moment. So imagine lots of papers and folders scheduled about. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So give me 1 second. Okay, that did not work as expected. Give me 1 second here. Okay, give me 1 second here. All right, I think you can now see my title slide. If not, please jump in and let me know. Title of my talk was actually changed from what Dana read, but similar focus this morning will be racial equity and mental health, centering youth voices with community-based participatory research. This is a roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about this morning. I'm going to start out with a little bit of background about the research that I do, but I want to spend most of the time talking about some youth-involved work that we've done in the racial equity and mental health space using community-based participatory research, or CBPR. So I'll spend most of the time talking about a research project that we did in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then I'll tell you about a new project that we've just begun here in Detroit, focusing on mental health and employment equity. I have a couple of closing slides just to kind of summarize some of the key strategies for thinking about youth involvement in research, and then hopefully we'll have some time for question and answers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about racism and adolescent health. Why are more Black children dying by suicide? Black teens face racial discrimination multiple times daily. 1 in 2 Black teens experienced racism online in 2020. Fewer Black teens seek treatment for depression. Suicide among Black girls is a mental health crisis hiding in plain sight. White Kansas City man charged over shooting Black teen. Black teens want more joy. The headlines I just read are real and actual headlines taken from recent news stories that paint a picture of racism and mental health for Black adolescents and Black youth. Over the last several years, there's been increased attention to the ways in which mental health shows up for Black adolescents in the news. And as you just heard from some of the headlines I read, there's been a lot of discussion around the crisis of Black youth suicide in America, with research showing that there's an increase in an alarming rate of suicide for all youth, but especially for African American youth. And it appears that some of the typical precursors, like having a plan, that are typically identified as precursors to suicide for youth and for people in general, Black adolescents don't always follow the same path or have those same precursors. So there's been some concern about what in fact leads up to Black youth suicide, why is the rate alarming, or why is the rate increasing, so on and so forth. You've seen a number of other headlines, not in the ones I just read, but focusing around COVID and the challenges of mental health. So you see a headline here that says more than half of Detroit students felt anxious or depressed pre-COVID. And there have been a number of headlines focusing on older adolescents and young adults on college campuses, highlighting the link between discrimination experiences and mental illness. A couple of other images for you to consider. Even though George Floyd may not have been a teen, there's been a discussion about the collective impact and trauma and vicarious trauma that Black youth may experience as a result of events that have taken place in our world and community. So this is our collective PTSD, one image says. There was significant discussion during the pandemic about the rate of Black Americans dying and how Black youth were impacted by the loss of parents and loved ones at rates that other groups may not have experienced. And this was not exclusive to Black adolescents. We know that Latino, Latinx youth also experienced this. Native and American Indian adolescents also experienced increased rates relative to white youth that raised some concern about the impact of the death and dying, not only on adolescents now, but thinking about their long-term mental health. There have been a number of other discussions with regard to Black mental health, focusing on what we call polysubstance use, the use of multiple substances like marijuana and alcohol as an increasing challenge and mental health vulnerability for Black youth. And there's certainly been a number of discussions around thinking about mental health in sports. We've seen this with Naomi Osaka, for example, and other Black women and other Black athletes who've increasingly been calling attention to the importance of mental health in their work and careers. Some of the headlines, although not as many as we would like, also focus on positive headlines. So there's been increased attention to breaking the stigma of talking about Black mental health. There's been increasing talk about barbershops and community forums as places and spaces where Black youth can talk about the experiences that they're having. And so we know that even as the headlines have a gloom and doom kind of feel to them, there are recognition that we're able to talk about mental health in ways that were very different than when I was an adolescent myself. Another sort of recognition is that there is sometimes, and youth have described this, maybe I'll mention a little later, a bit of an intergenerational tension where Black youth and adolescents are ready to engage issues of mental health, but talk about the tension that they sometimes feel with their caregivers who may not be on the same page and who may not see the value in talking about mental health in the same way that they do. And so some youth that we've worked with have actually asked how to navigate that intergenerational tension that sometimes arises. So in the work that we've been doing for the last 20 years or so, we've looked at the connection between racism and health, okay? I am particularly interested in adolescents. Most of my work focuses on middle and high school students and also college students. And we look at how these various racial discrimination experiences compromise not only the mental health, but the physical health of young people. We now know, and not surprise anyone on this call, that racism compromises the mental health and physical health of Black youth. What I've been interested in also underscoring are factors that allow Black youth to be resilient. We know that not all youth who experience racism have poor mental health or health outcomes. And so we've paid attention to things like racial identity. What are Black youth's sense of self? What is the sense and meaning of being African American? And how does that mitigate some of the impact of racism on health? We've looked at something called racial socialization. How do Black parents talk to their kids about race? And how does that mitigate some of the harmful effects of discrimination? And we've also looked in our work at African-centered values. How do values like religiosity and spirituality, how do values like cooperation and communalism also help to mitigate the effects of discrimination? And I won't go into a long litany of research findings here, but we found in our research that parents talking to their kids and their adolescents, these are middle and high school students, about being proud to be Black, parents who highlight that racism exists and talk about it with their youth, and also parents who go to various activities, buy their kids Black books, Black action figures and dolls. Those students and youth end up with more favorable health outcomes when they're engaged in that kind of family context, as opposed to parents who do not, or parents who don't talk about these kinds of issues. One other finding I'll share with you, a really interesting one, is that we found in one study that African American young adults, so these are older adolescents, who de-emphasize material possessions actually had lower blood pressure. So we know that there are a lot of factors that can come into play in terms of mitigating some of the harmful effects of racism and discrimination. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background, just to tell you about what I do and what we look at. I built this talk as focusing on racial equity and mental health work. And so I want to talk with you about a project involving photo voice, and I'll say a little bit more about what that is, and community-based participatory research, or CBPR, that we did several years ago in Raleigh, North Carolina. This image here is from 2015. It's actually taken here at the University of Michigan for something called the CBPR Partnership Academy. So in 2015, they had this week-long academy for folks who wanted to do more research in the community and partner with community organizations. And so this is my cohort of fellow academy members. But I show this to you as kind of the jumping off point for the work I began to do with CBPR in period. It was in North Carolina at the time. So my community partner here, Melvin Jackson in the blue shirt, was doing work in Southeast Raleigh at the time, focused on racial equity and mental health, working with Black adolescents who were very interested in issues around racial equity and mental health. And so we partnered. I had not done much community-based work at the time. Melvin and I came to Ann Arbor. He was well-versed in community partnerships, but I learned about how do we do CBPR with youth populations. And so that was a jumping off point for the research that I'm about to share with you. For those of you who are not familiar with CBPR, it's community-based participatory research. So CBPR is a partnership approach to research that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, and academic researchers in all parts of the research. It enables all partners to contribute. It enhances the common understanding that the community and the researchers have. And one of the reasons I really like CBPR is because it's not just research for research sake, but the knowledge that's gained from the research is taken to inform interventions and policy change to improve communities. The reason I'm sharing this research with you today is that this CBPR and partnership approach that we have used has not only equitably involved community members, but as you'll see shortly, youth voices have been a central part of the involvement and equitable partnership that we've tried to do as we've done this work. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the racial equity and mental health project that we did in Southeast Raleigh. Many of you may remember Michael Brown, so this predates the research that we did, but the notion of Black Lives Matter coming to the fore and lots of discussion, even before coronavirus, about fighting violence, police violence in particular, police murder, and systemic racism. We did a project to look at how youth were experiencing or thinking about systemic racism, mental health equity, using a technique called photo voice. So a short way of describing photo voice is photography plus social action. We gave youth cameras and allowed the youth to record and reflect on what they saw as some of the strengths and weaknesses of their communities in the context of racism and racial equity and mental health. The idea with this Youth Photo Voice project is that we wanted to promote dialogue and knowledge on issues pertaining to the experience of race in their communities and also mental health through the discussion of photographs. Photo Voice, as I mentioned earlier, is not just about taking pictures and talking about the pictures, but also empowering the youth to take action and to enhance the communities that they live in. So our Youth Photo Voice project involved African-American 8th graders in Southeast Raleigh. Just to give you a quick sense, Southeast Raleigh is situated in Wake County in North Carolina. Wake County is one of the, I think, has the best health profile in North Carolina in terms of health. But the health report for Southeast Raleigh is quite different from Wake County, in which Southeast Raleigh resides. So the health outcomes are quite disparate in disparities relative to Wake County and the rest of North Carolina. Melvin Jackson, whom I mentioned to you at the time, was affiliated with Strengthening the Black Family. And so together with the youth that Melvin was working with, we embarked upon this Photo Voice project. So let me tell you a little bit more about Photo Voice. Photo Voice typically occurs, people do it in lots of different ways, but we use a 5-session format. As you can see here, the first session is just kind of introductions and overview to what the project is about, establishing trust, developing group norms, having a mock photo session. And then the next 3 sessions, 2, 3, and 4, are really where the youth voices come to life. So the questions that you see here are actually questions that the youth themselves came up with. Why does racism still live? Why are people racist? In session 3, the youth wanted to know, how do we see or feel racial stereotypes in our everyday lives? Session 4, what brings races together versus keeps them apart? And in session 5, we wrapped up the 5-session Photo Voice. We prepared for the youth to present the research findings to their community in a community forum. And we began to think about the brainstorming with the youth. How do we take what we've learned in these Photo Voice sessions and use it to enhance the community? So this is the particular approach that we used. Again, we kind of, approach them, or I approach them saying, I'm broadly interested in mental health without a specific research agenda. And with Melvin, Melvin said, look, the youth right now are talking about mental health equity and race and racial equity. How can we use Photo Voice methods to kind of come up with an interesting set of topics. And so again, these are the questions that the youth, the 8th graders, came up with themselves that mapped onto thinking about their experiences of racism. So what does one of these sessions look like? In those middle sessions that I told you about, we use a format called SHOWed. SHOWed is an acronym, as you can see here, that basically starts out with a series of prompts that guide us through the pictures, okay? So before I go through the acronym, typically each week, youth would take the cameras, they would photograph pictures related to the prompt that the youth themselves decided on, and then they come back to the session. All of the youth would look at all of the photos together, and then the youth would vote on one of the photos that would be the focal photograph for the session, okay? So these groups, typically 8 to 10 youth, they all bring their photos that they took around a particular topic, and then the youth vote on one. Most times it works out. Occasionally there's 2 pictures and we kind of work with that. Once we have the photo selected, we go through this photo voice SHOWed approach. So S, we start out quite literally. What do you see in the picture? Can you tell us quite literally what is before us in this picture? The H, what is happening in the picture? So we go a little bit further and ask the youth to talk about what's happening. O, how does what we're talking about and what's happening in the picture relate to our lives? The W in SHOWed is, why does this issue even exist? The E is evaluation or empowerment. So more layers here. How can we become empowered with our new social understanding of what we just talked about? And then you'll see here that the D is, what can we do to address the issues that came up with our discussion? So again, these particular sessions were moderated by graduate students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but this is largely youth voices discussing the photos that they themselves have selected. So I want to show you some select results of the Youth Photo Voice project. Typically, when you use Photo Voice and report back on the findings, the youth themselves will report on various themes that came up from the transcripts. So these are all recorded sessions, and the researchers, myself, and others, in collaboration with the youth, identify themes. Usually starts with the researchers. The research say, here's what we think. The youth say, that's not quite it. I don't know if we agree. Or they say, yep, that's it. That's exactly what we think the transcript reflects. And so collaboratively, the youth shape the themes that I'm about to show you. Okay, so there were 5 themes that came up in our Youth Photo Voice project. And as I go through the next 5 slides, you'll hear some of the direct quotes from the youth who participated in this project. All right, so the first theme that came up was unity and fragmentation. We defined unity and fragmentation, which the youth named themselves, as a sense that fragmentation exists within the community and between races, most often unifying communities in times of tragedy or for survival. So you see here 2 images that the youth actually brought themselves. One was a picture of an intersection, Garner and Bragg, where a young African-American man was murdered and gunned down in Raleigh. And so when we asked that first question, how does racism live? Why does it exist? The youth brought in a picture of this intersection, okay? Here's a quote that came up in the discussion of that particular session. The youth said, you know, like Black youth only get together when something has already happened. I mean, like, we're not unified. We're not like together as a race. Nobody in Raleigh was all hanging out on Bragg Street until that guy got shot. Like, Black Lives Matter, the whole movement didn't even happen until a whole bunch of people started getting shot, because we really don't have our priorities like together. And we just sit around waiting for stuff to happen. And it's just like, the African-American community is not as close-knit together as it was before, okay? So that was one youth's reflection on thinking about Black Lives Matter, thinking about the shooting that happened in Southeast Raleigh. Another youth brought in a picture from a Black Lives Matter march that took place. They were struck by the fact that the folks who were at the Black Lives Matter were not only Black. So here's a picture of a white participant who was holding up a Black Lives Matter and participating in the rally. And the quote, which we selected to go along with this, was one young lady who said, one young woman who said, "We should build each other up instead of tearing each other down." So again, this sort of, and you'll see this through all the themes, or many of them, tension between unity and fragmentation. Okay, here's another theme that the youth came up with from the photos. The legacy of the African-American community and the history still has an impact on how youth experience racism today, okay? So this young man said, statistics are going to show, again, these are 8th graders, that Black people do more stuff than white people. They're referring to the justice system here, but that doesn't mean it's true, because it started like back in the time of Reconstruction. A Black person could go to jail for walking down the street and seeing a white person and not moving to the middle of the road. You could go to jail for really crazy and dumb stuff because they didn't know what to do without Blacks working on their plantation. So if you've already started putting people in jail for like dumb stuff and not knowing if they actually did the crime, and like it just keeps going on and on and on in history, okay? So again, this 8th grader is alluding not only to individual experiences of racism and discrimination that have been the focus of our research, but talking about some of the structural and systemic and institutional racism that is experienced, and making connections between those things that have happened historically and some of the things that youth are experiencing today in terms of disparities in outcomes. Here's another theme that the youth came up with, the racialized space. So the youth were really taken with how community spaces are commonly segregated by race and reinforced. There's that fragmentation again. So one young girl said, I don't know if it's just me, but the girls, it feels weird to be in my homeroom with a bunch of white girls because I can't talk to them because I'm like, and then, yeah, me too. Ooh, it's weird. And they act really stuck up, et cetera. So this conversation between two girls was kind of thinking about what is their experience in the classroom of experiencing these racialized spaces and the tension that they feel. I don't have a quote here, but another youth talked about the school bus setting, and they invoked Rosa Parks and Jackie Robinson, and they said, I don't understand how, even though Rosa Parks sat in her seat and sat in the bus, we still have the Black folks in the back of the bus, the white kids over here, the bus space they talked about as being a racialized space. Another youth talked about church on Sunday morning. This is a picture of a suit and tie, and this represents church, and we're still segregated in the church. So, you know, I don't understand why if we're all having the same goal, why can't we just do it together? Why do we have to separate ourselves from each other? Another 8th grader asked. All right, 2 more themes here. The next one, the youth and researchers came up with white privilege. White people have an internalized sense of superiority over Black people, and they receive benefits and privilege because of being white. So that was one of the, the definition that the researchers and the youth came up with. I don't have a direct quote for the image on the right, but as long as I've been doing photo voice research, this was one of the most profound images and discussions that I've actually heard in doing this work. So we started out with the S, what do you see? And the youth talked about how they see piano keys, they see Black keys, they see white keys. But then as we got to understanding how does this relate to our experience, one young girl said, when I look at this photo, I noticed that the Black keys are separated. The Black keys are unable to be together. And I noticed in contrast that the white keys are together. Moreover, she went on to explain that the Black keys are unable to come together because the white keys are united and the Black keys are not, okay? So this isn't a direct quote, but it gives you a feel for what this particular youth thought of when looking at this particular image. And you can imagine how youth photo voice can be a really effective method for bringing out kind of the experiences of youth through pictures. All right, I want to show you one more theme here. This was racial stereotypes. So the youth noted that a variety of stereotypes exist, and there are a couple of different ways that youth respond to stereotypes. So this particular session focused on the different ways that Black youth talked about through their pictures, coping with stereotypes. And so I'm actually going to read to you from some of their own voices some of the things that they talked about. So one of the strategies was internalizing. So a youth here says, people think like, oh, just because I'm Black, people think I'm going to act bad. I'm just going to decide like, oh, I'm sorry. People think I'm going to act bad. So I'm just going to decide like, okay, since I'm Black and I'm in this class, I'm going to act bad and I'm not going to do my work and I'm not going to try and stuff like that. Okay, so that was one person speaking to internalizing. The youth also discussed not caring or attempting to ignore the stereotypes. So another young girl said, like sometimes you just don't like, sometimes you have to like not care. Like, yeah, not put any energy into it. Okay, so that's kind of the ignoring strategy. Another youth talked about overcoming the stereotypes. So this youth said, you can't think that just because my generation is like that, referring to the stereotypes, that I'm going to grow up and be like a trash bag. Like, because I'm not. I'm going to be successful and I'll show you. And that gives me empowerment. Okay, so that came up in kind of this E part of the prompt, the empowerment discussion. And then finally, one youth kind of talked about accepting a lack of agency in response to stereotypes. Okay, so I can't change them. This youth says, you know, I don't think you're fully in control of it. I think you're like partially in control of it because like from the moment from the moment you look at somebody, you're already having thoughts about that person and what you think they're like, and you're already like making up what you think about that person. So this particular youth was saying, you know what, I really feel like I don't have much agency sometimes to change the stereotypes because people are going to see me one way regardless of how I want to be seen. Okay. Again, you get a sense of the richness of the voice and the ways that this discussion came from the photos that the youth themselves took and that the youth themselves processed, identified themes for, so on and so forth. All right, so this next slide just shows some of the themes and sort of things that we took away as researchers from the Photo Voice Project. We noticed that the 8th graders did experience youth as an organizing construct. They attempted to multiple levels of racial inequity. They weren't just talking about, you know, someone calling them a racial epithet. They linked the stereotypes, even though they didn't talk about mental health explicitly. They said that the stereotypes made them feel depressed, it made them feel anxious, and they talked about experiencing what they called serious mental health states. We also noticed in the discussions that stereotypes were linked with miseducation and some what we call self-hatred racial identity attitudes. So we found in our discussions, and I didn't amplify them here, but some youth were talking about having negative feelings about being African-American. Some of the Black boys were saying very sad and unfortunate things about the Black girls that were gendered and sexualized. And some of them, you know, reported, as I mentioned before, negative feelings about being African-American. So again, a really rich sort of jumping off point for getting a sense of how these 8th graders were experiencing racism in their communities. All right, following the following the Photo Voice Project, we did a couple of things. Well, I'm not going to report on, but we did a caregiver photo voice session about a year later, where we just worked with the caregivers of the youth. So similar process, different pictures, but same photo voice discussions. And then once the caregiver photo voice project was done, we brought everyone back in together And we had a series of what we called youth engagement sessions, where we wanted to try to unpack the experience of racism and the two photo voice projects that we did a little bit more. Okay, so the next set of slides just gives you some insight into, I think I have one slide on what the youth were, parents were asking us about, and then a focus on what the youth themselves talked about. So when we had these discussions with the parents and the youth together, one of the questions when we said, what do you need? How can the research be helpful? The parents said, we want to know how does racism impact our children? Some more recent discussions here in Michigan, how does the pandemic impact our children? How can we talk to our children about their racism experiences? What are some of the ways we can advocate for our children? How do we equip our children to handle racism experiences? So on and so forth. Okay, so since our focus is on youth, I won't read the last two, but you get a sense of some of the things that the parents and caregivers were thinking about. Here are the things that the adolescents were thinking about. They wanted to know, how do we cope with instances of school discrimination? So when we experience discrimination in the school context, how do we cope with it? How do we confront racism respectfully? This was a question that just blew my mind in terms of thinking about the mental health burden of Black adolescents and youth. So not only do they have to show up and do the work that they're expected to do, not only do they have to cope with experiences of discrimination in the school setting, but they also have to think about how to cope with these in ways that aren't going to escalate the situation. So they can't just respond to racism, they have to do it respectfully. How do we interact with our peers when we experience racism and discrimination? How can we get our parents to understand the significance in mental health and mental health advocacy? So that goes back to some of that intergenerational tension that I mentioned earlier. Some of the youth that spoke with us, even with their caregivers there, said, our parents don't get it. They don't understand mental health. They are telling us to go pray, and we don't think that that's as effective. The youth said, we need adults to listen and help us make supportive connections. We need adults to act. Okay, so again, these are some of the voices and things that the youth said in these conversations. All right, a couple more things here in these engagement sessions. I asked the youth in particular, tell me about some of the specific ways you're experiencing racism in your classroom and at schools. The youth talked about differential and selective enforcement of the dress code and off-campus travel. So some of the young Black girls said, the white girls violate the dress code. We violate it too sometimes, but we notice that when we don't follow the dress code, we're more likely to be disciplined for not being in compliance. Some of the Black boys and also Black girls talked about how they were more likely to be stopped to show their passes for off-campus travel, whereas they noticed that their white counterparts were not. And so they talked about double standards. The youth talked about the selection criteria for gifted and talented programs. One young lady in particular remembers that she felt she had the same credentials as another white student. She was not selected for the program, but her white peer was. And so she experienced this as a racialized experience, not being selected for the program. One of the more profound descriptions that youth gave in terms of how they experience racism is they talked about the nonverbal ways that their teachers are racist. Okay, so I particularly remember one youth who said, Dr. Neblett, racism isn't like it was during your time, okay? They said it's a lot more indirect, it's a lot more subtle now. And so the youth collectively described a process where they noticed that their teachers changed their tone of voice when talking to them. They noticed that the teachers would slow down and speak to them in a way that made them feel not as intelligent. They noticed that their teachers would lean in and talk really slowly while they were talking with them, which was a very different way that the teachers were engaging with some of the other students. So there was nothing blatant here, but the youth said, we want to know, why are our teachers talking to us in this different way? It doesn't make us feel very good. It makes us feel like we're not as smart, etc. They talked about people being surprised and shocked when they were successful. And they also talked about, the girls in particular, physical space. So walking down the hallway and people just expecting them to move out of the way, and how they experience this as a type of gendered racism. The boys didn't report this as much, but the girls noticed that on the sidewalks outside of school and in school, they were expected to move out of the way. Okay. How does this impact youth mental health? We asked the youth directly. They said, we feel tired. They talked about mental fatigue. They said being woke is being tired, constantly being vigilant and on guard. We feel angry. We feel underappreciated and undervalued. We second guess ourselves. We ruminate. They didn't call it rumination. That's my lingo for it. But they talked about constantly thinking about, am I good enough? Questioning their self-worth over and over and over again. They did report feeling confused. They reported feeling hurt by some of the ways that they were treated. They reported wanting to withdraw socially. And one young girl described, didn't use the word dehumanization, but talked about feeling less than human. One girl, the same one, described feeling like they were on display at a zoo. Okay, so again, you had a sense of the dehumanization. So those were the conversations we had with the youth. I told you that photo voice and engaging this way is not the end point of the discussion. And so the youth themselves, when we said, what do we do about it, did a number of things. So one, they hosted a community forum in Southeast Raleigh and in partnership with Southeast Raleigh Promise, or SERP, that focused on mental health for Black youth. They also did a forum that was youth-led on gentrification and the effects of gentrification on the mental health of the community. Okay, so this came out of the discussions from the Photo Voice Project. In addition to the youth forums that they engaged in, they generated a number of solutions and ways that they could take action. Okay, so the youth wanted to put together books and experiences on a website. They were just starting this work as I was leaving North Carolina. I'm not sure what the status of the project is now. They wanted to have a racism experiences panel in which youth would be able to talk about some of the very experiences that I just mentioned. Several of the youth suggested that maybe there could be some kind of youth lock-in that would have continuing sessions where people would come back to and check in a couple times a year or at least once a year. They talked about maybe some sort of camp that could focus on coping with these types of experiences and equipping them with the skills to deal with racism in the school setting. And they talked about awareness campaigns is the last one I'll mention. So you may remember there was a period where folks were using these placards to show different types of experiences that they were having. And so one of the youth suggested as an idea that on one day they could show up to school and just hold their placards kind of describing in front of their faces different racism experiences that they had had in school as a way of generating discussion. So again, youth voice, these were all not things that the researchers suggested, and researchers who do CBPR are different in that they try to engage this action process with the community. This is very different than another place where the focus groups might be done and the survey, and then the project would end. So collaboration with the youth. Okay, so I spent most of my time focusing on that project And hopefully that gives you an illustration of how youth voice can be used in community-based participatory research. It looks like I have about 5 minutes here. And so I want to tell you about a new project that we've just begun, although not in as much detail because we haven't collected the data yet, right here in Raleigh. So this new project is entitled Focused Mental Health, a stress and workforce development intervention promoting racial and economic justice among youth. And so this is a partnership with Focus Hope in Detroit. Many may be familiar with Focus Hope, civil rights organization that's been around for a long time, that serves a number of residents in Detroit, including youth populations. So I went to Focus Hope. Actually, I met them through a discussion several years ago. And as part of those discussions, mentioned that we did CBPR, and we wanted to know what were the issues of significance at Focus Hope that related to mental health. One of the issues that came up was around job training. So Focus Hope has a number of job training programs. People go through programs sometimes as short as a week, but their longest program is about 16 weeks. And then they're placed in different places to promote employment, okay? During the pandemic, what was happening is that a lot of the Black youth who started the job training programs were not finishing the programs, okay? So they would, not make it through the programs, or even if they completed the programs, when it was time to be placed in the programs, they would experience great levels of anxiety. Some of the workforce specialists have described panic attacks that the youth would experience when they were preparing for their interviews, so on and so forth. And so what Focus Hope told me is that their idea or why people were having so much difficulty is that mental health was intervening. People were dealing with a lot of COVID-related mental health sorts of issues. People were experiencing loss. And so Focus Hope said, you know what? When we look at the residents that we serve, mental health is almost non-existent in the programs that we do. So we have food vouchers, we have rental assistance, we have transportation vouchers, but mental health, even though we've just lost a couple of families, death by suicide, parents who have been lost to suicide, we don't really do anything in the mental health space. And so we want to partner with you to figure out how we can do a better job of addressing mental health in job training programs in particular. And so out of this discussion and conversation, a partnership was born, a research practice partnership with Focus Hope, focusing on job training programs and mental health, okay? So the project overview is really looking at how we can get the workforce training programs that Focus Hope currently offers to be enhanced with mental health support. So what does bringing mental health into the programs look like? And we're doing that to ultimately improve employment, mental health outcomes for Black youth who are participating in these programs. Here's the youth component. Of course, we're using CBPR, but we're not just kind of randomly deciding what the intervention is going to look like. We're being very intentional and asking youth who have participated in prior workforce development programs to help us think about what are the mental health barriers to participating in these programs. Okay, so we're going to start out with a couple of focus groups where we invite the youth to talk about what they think are some barriers to participating. We're going to do this with youth who participated in the programs and youth who have not. The youth who have not will say, if you were going to participate in a workforce program, what do you think, would be barriers, or what would be important to incorporate from a mental health perspective? We're going to do a photo voice project. So similar to what we just did, or I just described, we're going to do a youth photo voice project focused on mental health barriers to employment and workforce. So these two components, the focus groups and the photo voice, are going to be used to shape the program that we're ultimately going to create and implement in Focus Hope. And the exciting thing about this is Focus Hope is hoping that even though we're just focusing on workforce development programs, that there's going to be a ripple effect and mental health will be considered youth-informed through some of the other programs that they offer to their residents. By the way, we're also going to be doing interviews to try and understand, once we actually develop the programs with the youth, what things work, what doesn't, et cetera. So youth-informed, youth voices, et cetera. All right, this is a busy slide. I'm really going to I've talked about AIM 2. I'm not going to talk about 3 and 4. This is a slide I just used. But what I want to point out is that we have a steering committee under AIM 1 that is kind of the decision-making body of the organization. And importantly, on our steering committee, we have several youth members some of whom have participated in the programs, who are a part of making decisions about this project. So every decision we make, who's going to be the focus groups, how we're going to recruit, what questions we're going to be asked, is going to be informed by youth participation. Okay, now it's not a separate youth advisory board, and CBPR is very particular about the language. So many will argue that, we don't just want the youth to advise us, but we want the youth to actually be a part of the discussion and decision making. And so the steering committee actively involves youth who are present at our monthly meetings to make decisions about our project. Okay, so I just want to highlight that as another way of thinking about having youth voice involved in community-based participatory research. All right, so a couple of quick reflections here as I wrap up. What are some of the ways and strategies for centering youth voices? I've shared with you a number here. So diverse methodological approaches, I think using techniques like photo voice, giving youth the opportunity to reflect the strengths of their community, partnering with the youth, using CBPR in equitable ways is one strategy for centering youth voices. Another strategy is creating brave and equitable spaces that invite, value, and privilege youth voices. So I described in our work today some of the ways that we did that in community forums. We didn't use town halls, but we will be doing that in the Focus Hope project. And so how can we create opportunities like barbershops, like these discussions that allow youth to be in conversation, not only with us as researchers and others in their community, but with each other. Finally, another strategy that I hope you take away is youth-led initiatives, collaboration, and consultation. So the youth-led forums about gentrification, they went out and took the research results. The dissemination that you see here, the youth themselves actually were reported out. Those slides that I showed you, those were in collaboration with youth. And then they reported what they found with their research collaborators. So collaboration and partnership has to be important. Consultation, but I would argue not only consultation, just asking them for quick feedback, but involving the youth in part of all the decision-making that takes place to inform the decision-making. Okay, so some concluding thoughts here. I just want to reiterate that racism constitutes a significant risk to the health and mental health of Black adolescents and other racial and ethnic groups who experience marginalization. Some key research strategies for promoting youth outcomes include using diverse methods that are a little bit outside the box, brave and equitable spaces that allow youth to talk about what they're experiencing, and youth-informed partnerships. Number 3, youth-led collaborations and initiatives are needed to rid society of structural racism and racial disparities and improve the health of all adolescents, youth, and people. I'd like to conclude here with some of the collaborators on the Photo Voice projects. And as you can see here, and as typical in Photo Voice research, we share with permission the youth investigators who are considered a part of the research team and who were an instrumental part of presenting these research findings. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to speak with you this now afternoon, and I look forward to some time for question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Neblett, for what was a powerful and impactful talk this morning into the afternoon. And there are a few questions that have come up that I want to ask of you from the audience. One of those questions is dealing with, at the end, you said how important it is to involve youth and to use out-of-the-box thinking and how you're engaging youth to really get down to the core. So from a research perspective, what are your thoughts on engaging in youth in the project while upholding the methodology rigor? And this is from Priscilla Liu. So how do you maintain your research methodology rigor while also engaging youth in the process?
Okay, thank you for that question, Priscilla. I think in terms of rigor, I'll give you photo voice, which is a sort of qualitative approach, qualitative technique, and we're well versed in how do we, we know the process for transcripts, identifying themes, et cetera. So it's really not that much different than in terms of a rigor perspective. We have transcripts, we have data-rich information. And so even though the youth aren't researchers themselves, we collaborate with them. And in the same way that you would code an interview with anyone, the rigor is upheld. It's not like just because youth are the participants that it's somehow less rigorous. And then in standard dissemination efforts, you're coding and doing the same techniques and things that are widely recognized and accepted. And so I think, this is maybe a more straightforward answer, but I think there are ways that even when something is sort of out of the box, so-called, linking it to what strategies are kind of validated and supported, and trying to use those techniques to the extent possible. I think sometimes you have to push outside of the box. If there's something that's really different and doesn't lend itself, then you push a little bit. We've published a number of papers recently where we've said, you know what, there are multiple ways of knowing. Rigor is relative. It's a scientific and cultural term. And so if I just have a conversation with a youth, even if it doesn't have hundreds of people, that is knowledge and that is information. And so we've tried to push the envelope on traditional standards of what represents rigor.
Thank you for that. So keeping along with the idea of the youth, the photo voice, how did you recruit the youth in North Carolina for the project? And were the students or the young people all volunteers?
Yep, they were all volunteers. We were very fortunate. So Melvin was working with a number of parents in a number of school districts through the Strengthening the Black Family. And so on the slide, you may have noticed under recruitment, it said Strengthening the Black Family. The families that were participating and active in that organization, which unfortunately has since been discontinued due to funding issues, recruited for the Photo Voice project. So Melvin and I had conversations. Melvin was working in conjunction with some students at the School of Public Health at University of North Carolina. And so he shared the information at a meeting. I also came to a meeting at Strengthening the Black Family. We shared a little bit about the project, and then the parents who were really excited about this work said, we have some people we think would be really good for this. We're going to spread the word. Parents told their youth about it, and then youth decided whether they wanted to participate or not.
So it's also kind of falling into line with the community-based participatory research principles, where if you're working in partnership with community organizations and kind of working with them and allowing them to also work on that recruitment because they're trusted sources in that community that then got parents involved. And if you get the parents involved, they get their kids involved and so forth. So that process around CBPR is important, or was important for this process.
Yep, absolutely.
So someone who is from North Carolina, was asking, how do you get youth who may be disengaged to want to participate and learn more during the Photo Voice projects? Or and that you asked about the volunteering. So they are volunteering to do it, but did you have youth who were disengaged in the process, and did their journey change over time?
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of disengaged youth. A lot of times there's sort of youth know that their peers, another technique and strategy, are excited about it. They will come and at least check it out. And in our case, I don't know if it's the case for all Photo Voice experiences, but once the youth came and saw, how fun it was to pick pictures, to vote, select the pictures, and then talk about things, that just generated the discussion. We actually didn't have to do a whole lot there. In my experience of doing this research over the years, what I have found is that the youth, in particular some of the young men, are not always given the opportunity and in spaces where their voices are valued. And so if you just put them in a space where they're able to talk and engage, they just are happy to have someone who will listen. So I think thinking about how to engage someone before they come to Photo Voice who may be disengaged is a different kind of question that would require a little bit further thought. But once we actually got folks to the sessions themselves, we didn't have any trouble. If anything, one of the challenges was sometimes sports and finding a time that everyone could meet and getting folks to come back, but it wasn't for lack of interest.
Mm. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more, Dr. Neblett, about getting the young men in the room, and then they're just having a place to share. Were they finding that a space where they could, one of the few spaces that they could share? Or say a little bit more about that, because we often talk about young boys or don't express themselves.
Yeah, we didn't ask them specifically, is this one of the only spaces that you can? From doing the work, and because of the just excitement that they would have to see researchers who looked like them, and to be in a space that we're asking about their experiences and these issues, we found that was an exciting for them to engage. I have this is a little bit tangential. My brother lives in Brooklyn, was in Harlem for a while, and he does youth programs around, he's a playwright by training, but he has youth kind of write their own plays and perform the plays. And we really have seen, or I've seen through his work, young Black males, Black adolescent males come to life when they're able to create their own stories and use the artistic process to give voice to their experience. So again, this is not a traditional research methodology. I do think Photo Voice has an artistic component to it. And if you find someone who's likes art or Photo Voice, it just naturally brings people in, because it's not just a traditional kind of asking about questions or filling out, circling numbers on a paper or looking at a screen. It's interactive, et cetera. So I think the artistic aspect of it is a way that we've seen a lot of young Black men be able to engage with this process.
That process of creative expression allows them to share who they are.
Yes.
Hopefully, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
One from Janine, who's asking, how do you prioritize caring for yourself in this work when or if you share identities with the young people you are partnering with?
Okay, give it to me one more time. So how do I engage in self-care when I'm engaging with the youth around this work?
Yes.
I don't know. I'm a pretty, sometimes I need to do a better job. I think we all do, of self-care. I think transparency is one way. Sometimes I, share a lot of my own personal experiences. That's a form of self-connection, or not self-connection, connecting with the youth and inspiring them to link to their experiences that they've had. And then in terms of the self-care piece, sometimes I will just be quite honest and say, I haven't been taking as much good care of myself. I need to sleep more. I've been going. Oftentimes when I see youth who are engaging in these patterns that I have engaged in, I'll say, you know what, we've all got to do this collectively. How can we hold each other accountable? So vulnerability, transparency, sharing my own experience are some ways, but I'll be the first to tell you that we all need to do a better job with
Better
that.
job at caring for yourself, because this is really heavy and powerful work. And so what?
Let me, Dan, if I can say one more thing.
Sure.
There's a duality here and a fine line, right? So in talking about Tyree Nichols with some youth this semester, this was a lot to bear. And as these were public health youth students here, as I began, engaging about what happened, I became very emotional in talking with these youth. I even broke down while I was talking. And in the moment, that was a moment of like, wow, this is a lot. We're really carrying a lot. We're all bearing a lot here in the space. At the end of the semester, what one of the youth, a young lady told me, she said, you know what, I really appreciated the fact that you were vulnerable and transparent in your feelings, because that allowed me to know that issues of public health still have a space to connect, and that we can be vulnerable and that we can be transparent in. And that's an important part of what got me excited about the work and makes me excited about continuing to do the work. So a little bit tangential to the original question, but I think it's important to share that even sometimes when we're not taking care of ourselves, the connection and people seeing you go through the process can be a way of bringing other people into a field, getting them excited about the work and thinking about how we collectively take care of ourselves.
And in that moment, Dr. Neblett, that may have been a sense of self-care.
Oh, I will, yes.
So, yes, so thank you. So we are out of time. There were two other questions that I really wanted to get to, but maybe we'll share them post and get your response to them. But I want to thank you again so much for this wonderful, but yet very deep topic and sharing it with us this morning. I am going to hand it over to Ayush.